This session is going to be presented by Larry Foster. I'm excited about this one because Larry has been on the front lines of managing technology products for the past 20 years as an executive, most recently at Calero MDSL, one of the market leaders in this space. He is a founding member, past president, and Hall of Fame inductee of the Enterprise Technology Management Association, and a founding member of the CompTIA Telecom Advisory Council. His strategic view on managing technology services and life cycles is unparalleled in our industry, and I'm excited for you to get this rare view into the strategic view of TEM. Please ask your questions in the chat window and give some pound signs to applaud. Please welcome Larry to TEM Expo.
All right. Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. The presentation I'm going to go over, the information I'm going to go over today, really builds on all the foundational and best practices, principles that you discussed throughout the day. But this slide is a really great way of illustrating the challenges you're going to face in explaining your program. You know, you can say it 10 ways to Tuesday, what you can do, the actual activities, and you, in your heart and your mind, you know what the value you can provide. But I can tell you the people on the other side, and I see this even more now that I've retired from the TEM industry, they're not connecting with the message you're receiving. So what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is to give you information, help you understand where they're coming from, and then help you understand how to articulate the value proposition of expense management in terms that will resonate with your C-level staff. So let's start off with the way value is even created. You know, traditionally people think of an organization as the way I get things done, as I talk to my boss, who talks to their boss, and then they bring it down and you propagate it throughout the industry. Now with the acceleration of cloud adoption and even more with this COVID, it's going at beyond hyperspeed. The concept of self-service fulfillment is being completely flipped and accelerated. What was going to take 2 to 3 more years is now being done in a matter of weeks and months. So what's key to understand is when you talk about articulating the value proposition, you need to think how value is created, and it's created horizontally throughout your organization. So a lot of stuff I'm going to talk about today is how to establish cross-functional collaboration with the right stakeholders within your organization and the technology service providers outside your organization. And what you're going to find is a whole new dimension, a whole new world of a value proposition. But what's new, what's old is new again, because it's built upon the same principles that telecom expense management has been following since its inception. So I want to start off with the concept of Gartner, you'll hear this used a lot, called the hype cycle. And really what it means is something happens, a new innovation happens, and it triggers a lot of interest. And you get this peak inflated expectations, and then it kind of dies out. Sometimes it dies out completely. They call that the trough of disillusionment. But then as the product matures and the industry matures and solutions mature, you get this slope of enlightenment and what they call the platform of productivity, the plateau of productivity. The same thing applies to TEM. You do your implementation, wow, we kicked butt, we reduced our operating expenses by 25%, but then the challenge is people expect you to repeat that year over year. Whereas the value proposition starts to shift in traditional TEM, where now you're going into preventing expenses, but it's very difficult to explain because people aren't seeing net new gains and savings in their cost. So we're going to talk about how to avoid being stuck in the trough by transitioning or evolving into a strategic enabler. Now, how do people actually get stuck in this trough of disillusionment? So this was another chart that came from Gartner, and really it shows the challenges. So in a typical low governance, when they did all their statistical modeling and gathered all their survey information, you get that big bang 30% savings in year 1. And you see that with the first bar chart. But what happens, as we explained earlier, as the program matures, you're correcting all the, you picked up all the apples that have fallen on the floor, if you will. Now you're actually in operational mode. And by year 3, people are going, do we even need TEM anymore? Everything's working just fine. And it looks worse when you're actually going into an operation that actually has some level of governance. So what we're going to talk about in this presentation is how to avoid the year 2 plus doldrums. And the key to that is not thinking about TEM as a project. Now, you've implemented TEM, TEM is done. You need to think about it as a product. And the concept of that a product is continually being enhanced, continually being extended based on the value that you identify that your stakeholders want to receive. Now, how's that done? Well, you're going to be coming, and you already have been for a long time, but it's the new marketing term, the ICT, the Information Communication Technology Service Broker. You're going to transform from the perception of being a tactical reactive, you're fixing the trouble tickets, you're installing circuits, you're processing the bills, into a strategic collaborative enabler. Now I'm going to start off with kind of looking at the big picture, and I borrowed this images from a book called Technological Revolutions and Financial Capital, written by Carlota Perez back in 2002. I found it very interesting because we are right in the middle of what she calls the fifth cycle of technology. And you've heard about this in the history books, starting back with the Industrial Revolution and into the current framework of which we call the Age of Information and Telecommunications, which really started about 50 years ago in 1971. Now, what's important, the reason I brought this out, is these cycles last about 50 years, but they're lasting shorter and shorter. And we're at a critical paradigm shift or a change now, because in this technology, you're seeing a lot of the technologies that were really cool and really disruptive just a few years ago have now become stabilized and they're becoming commoditized because they're maturing. So if you look at the information communication technologies, things that were futuristic years ago are now becoming common. Everything from VoIP to 5G into the whole UCaaS and SaaS and all that fun stuff, and even the robotic process automation. And you're hearing about this even in granted, this book was written 18 years ago. You're hearing about now with even COVID, the whole bio technology and how they're accelerating that. So now bio's, kind of following us, about 50 years behind. They're going to be going through their trend. Now, the reason I brought this up is because now is key, as you notice in the second half of these technology deployments, in the deployment stage, you start to getting into widespread acceptance. And now we're starting to see where things are no longer just, I need the next iPhone, I need the next mobile device, I need the next this. Now they got to start proving their purpose, the companies that are producing them and the consumers that are using them. And that's where the role of the technology service broker with regards to ICT becomes so very important. So here's another version of a hype cycle. Gartner publishes things about technology all the time. So I put this one up about cloud services. When we look at cloud services, they define it as a disruptive technology. People think disruptive brought something brand new. When in reality, what it's doing is displacing something that's already established. It shakes up the industry. In this case, we know it's shaking up how people can access services. They can get them on demand. And it also changes the entire business model. Now, what I'm going to do is walk through some key elements of this hype cycle as it relates to being a telecom expense management manager. So let's think. You're familiar with the concept of SaaS, but what I'm doing here is saying, well, what you're looking at is the business financial model side, which is really something that's modeled by named subscriptions. Where does expense management come into play? Well, HR has people coming and going all the time. It's very common, I should say. When you do an audit of a company, you'll find out they've got with a lot of ghost employees. People are still paying for their NetSuite or their Salesforce subscription, but they've already left the organization. Or more commonly, they've moved cost centers and the wrong cost center is paying for it. You start to see a commonality or correlation to what expense management's been doing in the telecom world for a long time. Going at a couple other of these technologies, you look at IaaS Plus is when people just take their software that they have and they move it to a public infrastructure. Now you're starting to get charged per metered second for the cycles you're using. Now, there's a lot of variables there that include, bandwidth uploads, bandwidth downloads, your server, what type of server you're using, how much memory, and the configuration and the storage. Again, metered usage, something that people need to get a handle on. Although it's very simple to get to cloud, it can be very expensive. And if you're not budgeted for it and you didn't architect the business model up front, your companies can get themselves in a lot of trouble. IaaS, per second metering again. You look at platform as a service, which is becoming more and more popular. Now we're no longer getting into the actual physical infrastructure because it really may not be an infrastructure. Now you're just using and dipping into databases based on a per transaction. Again, metered usage in some way, shape, or form. Now here we start to see on this hype cycle, now you see we're going out of the trough of disillusionment. what you're seeing is people start to get into the plateau of productivity. Now the management starts to come into play. And organizations start embracing these concepts and these new management paradigms where you're promoting best practices. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit as we get to how you're going to engage your organization. Going through a couple more of these technologies. On the cloud bursting side is another model, is where you have an infrastructure, but you're bursting it just like we used to do during the ISDN days. Again, looking at the combination of premise and maybe even private and public data centers. Cloud service brokerage, where you're actually going to a third party and outsourcing that. All these different models, and nobody is 100% public, nobody's 100% private, and obviously people are looking at expanding beyond premise. So you're needing to looking at multiple vendors, the wheelhouse of what telecom expense management professionals have been about all the time. So it's very common to have multiple cloud vendors supporting your infrastructure. You're getting into the whole software defined, again, a combination of premise and different chargeback models, cost allocation. The API model, very similar to what we talked about on PIAS. Multi-cloud, we already mentioned that, multiple vendors. And then on the cloud service expense, which is kind of like a cousin to telecom expense management, but they're really focused on one specific thing. They've done it very well. And you're starting to see telecom expense management expand into that. And you're seeing cloud service expense management solution vendors partner with telecom expense management vendors. And finally, getting into somebody just outsourcing the whole thing for managed services. Cloud tethering, you're probably used to seeing an app on your mobile phone. Now you're having to manage not only the mobile app, the actual device, the network connectivity, subscription, all that fun stuff on top of the cloud service you're getting to. Now let's flip it over and look at the other side of it, the complementary side, which is unified communications as a service. And the way I define that, it's everything from your voice, video, messaging, webinars, etc. And what a key point here, and this number again was a year old, by 2021, 90% of IT will be purchased as non-premise. COVID has actually accelerated that. So a lot of people are trying to, what is very common is the infrastructure and services are deployed, and now telecom expense management's having to play catch up. So let's go look at where this is. So UCaaS, as we mentioned, it's the full spectrum of those services. You have your Microsoft, you have your Cisco's, you have all the traditional vendors, but this is where you're seeing multiple vendors supporting your communication services. And people need to be careful of the classical freemium, when they're getting it for free, but then they've reached a certain threshold and now they're having to pay. Cloud Office is the whole desktop suite and what you're doing to pay for it. Now, communications itself is no longer about getting the voice, but it's customizing it. And now you're getting into integrating your voice into other systems. And now, not only are you paying for the service, you're also paying for the transactions in addition to that. Web RTC, web real-time communication, that's everybody's place right now. You know, we're using Zoom on a daily basis. That's an example of web real-time communication. People weren't even talking about this stuff a year ago, and now they're finding out they're having bills coming in that they don't even know who started up the subscription yet. IoT is really another, think of it as a whole bunch of devices spread throughout the world, capturing data over your network. What do they look like? Anything from telematics on your vehicles to monitoring and managing things throughout your infrastructure. Again, now you're having to worry about the subscription. Something has to be applied, subscribed to a carrier network, and you're having to manage those. And 5G, you know, enough said about that. You know, you'll hear a lot more about that around Christmas time when all the new mobile devices are coming out. So what is the type of insights that your technology service brokers provide to the expense management? On one side, you're helping them grow the business. On the other side, you're helping them run the business. So let's go look at the guardrails. You have insights that you can help them improve their operating revenues. Going back to that first slide, we're no longer talking about procurement, provisioning, and payments. Now we're talking about how the expense management program is going to help them improve their operating revenues, reduce their cost, and in addition, give them the information they need to help streamline change management, proactively mitigate risk, and improve operational performance. How's this done? Everything that happens on the network creates a digital footprint, a digital transaction. And what you're doing is helping them statistically analyze this information, bringing it to their point, organizing it, aggregating it, and presenting it in the way that they can help understand it. Expense management, you'd say, well, how are we helping them improve revenues? If you can give them usage information, as we talked about, all those different usage transactions, and they can correlate that information, which are patterns, which represent the habits, they can correlate that to their employees. Now they can start to see patterns of behaviors that help them model their high-performing employees and their employees that maybe need some coaching and improvement. And what you're now doing is now you're not only affecting the expense of the actual physical technology, you're giving them information to help manage the expense of the most expensive part of their budget, which is human capital. Streamlining change management, it's getting into looking at the digital transactions, everything that happens, and making sure that you're looking at how the suppliers and the service delivery people are performing relative to SLAs. Again, classic wheelhouse information for telecom expense management. Mitigating risk, you're actually tracking the information and helping them understand, when they may be running out of a particular agreement, or whether they're meeting their minimum usage commitments and they're going to be able to get the rates that they thought they negotiated. And then the operational performance, looking, as I said, at the OLAs and latency points, everything that we communicate with, the ITSM system talks to the ITFM system, talks to the expense management, talks to some external supplier, and a CRM system. All of that is creating digital transactions that can be brought together under the expense management insights. And then finally, what's been there all along is identifying unused and underutilized assets and helping them identifying, look, you've got these orphaned disk drives, you disconnected the server, you did nothing with the disk drive, you're still getting charged for it. So the challenge with cloud is you don't just disconnect the server, you got to disconnect all the peripheral elements. People don't realize all along they're paying for IP addresses, they're paying for storage, they're paying for network activities that they don't even use anymore. So here's an example of how you start correlating the services you provide to the value that your stakeholders and C-level executives need. Now, what's the spectrum of information? Everything that's going on today relates to, it's either enabled by information communication technology or it is an information communication technology service. So your opportunities are growing and growing. And as we mentioned, speaking in the terms of your C-level executive, they really speak in 4 different dimensions: business results. As we talked about 2 slides ago, what value, how can I increase my recurring revenues, my annual revenues, my total contract values? It gets down to looking at those digital transactions. How can I help reduce my costs? Again, looking at things that aren't being used, looking at how things are being used, looking at repurposing them rather than just acquiring new, looking at the quality. The telecom expense management area has the ability to look at these transactions and determine how responsive we are with our clients and how responsive our suppliers are with us. And then looking at the engagement, you can provide your managers information about the services you're providing, what type of iPhone, what type of services they're providing when they're traveling internationally, what cloud services they have, and they can start correlating that, because a lot of times in the digital worker, their engagement goes down when they're not given the technology to actually do their job, or not unreliable technology is just as bad. So how do we evolve? How does this transition actually look? We start off in the world that you're all familiar with, the pre-TEM world, the world of spreadsheets and masterful, pivot tables and all that fun stuff, a lot of disparate manual reports. You become a professional at that. And then at some point you implement your TEM system. Now you got your data organized, you're enabling access to this information, and you're starting to automate the life cycle of loading those invoices. And this is a lot of times where people stop. This is what we do. This is what I'm explaining. Ta-da. And then you get stuck in that year 2 and year 3 and year 4, depreciating value proposition. What we're talking about is getting through that trough of disillusionment and getting into the plateau of productivity. Now you start looking at TEM plus phase 1. You're implementing these standards and applying these best practice principles across your entire spectrum of technology services. And you're applying those principles, not just being stuck with telecom, but all digital services. And then you start looking at expanding those principles into your SLA enforcement and your cost management, helping not just process the bills and allocate the costs, but identify things that don't need to be charged for anymore, and helping those people save money on their budgets. And this is when you become continuing to increase. It almost looks like a plateau of productivity, where now you're being recognized as a strategic enabler. because you're providing the business intelligence insights that they need to actually make those decisions. We talked about helping them run the company and grow the company. So what we're talking about and recommending is you are best positioned with this information you have, with this program you've implemented, with the technology services you have and the BI insights to lead these cross-functional collaboration efforts. You build upon the existing domain expertise you've established in one digital platform called telecommunications and expand it across the entire cloud platform. You're helping them replicate these best practices, and then you're helping them understand, doing these prototypes, understanding, whether these services are going to provide them better cost, better value for what they're investing, or whether they're deploying things that aren't even being used. So my closing thoughts here. I would say, in the great words of Smokey the Bear, in the word of telecom expense management, remember, if I could do the Sam Elliott voice, only you can prevent wasteful spending. And that's where your value proposition becomes. You're no longer waiting just to process invoices and allocate the cost. You're helping use this information, and as time goes on, getting enough statistical data to even do some predictive and down the road prescriptive type information to help them when they should expand and when they should move to a different platform. Think of expense management not as a series of a bunch of discrete projects. When you're buying a new company, you're moving to a new building, but it's a product that you're continuously improving by engaging your stakeholders, that horizontal workflow we talked about. Now you're going to transform your traditional subject matter expertise into becoming a full-fledged technology service broker. And wink, wink, you've always been that, but now you're expanding it across all technologies. And you need to look and engage your people to understand how you can insert yourself in what part of microsegment you provide as the cross-functional collaboration in their value streams. And then on a quarterly basis, you need to do these business reviews and constantly remind people, these are the services we're providing, these are the changes that were made, these are the inefficiencies that were prevented, and these were the value you're getting from it. And by doing all this, you're actually enhancing and maturing and evolving your traditional telecom expense management program from tactical, transactional, into strategic enablement. And that's all I got there. Thank you very much.
All right, that was a great session. Thank you so much for that presentation today. So, our speaker will be in the chat room for the remaining period of time, so please ask your questions and continue the conversation. And then please join us for the rest of our sessions coming up. Visit our sponsors, MobiCord, Upland Software, Vision Wireless, and WidePoint in their booths, and then also hang out with us in the networking lounge. Have a great event.